Sometimes the most profound moments in life arrive without fanfare, wrapped in the quiet dignity of an ordinary day. In a small hospice room in Memphis, where sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, two men from vastly different worlds were about to share an encounter that would reshape both their lives. One was America's most beloved voice, Morgan Freeman, who had narrated countless stories but was about to discover one that would leave him speechless. The other was James Sullivan, a dying English teacher who had spent 40 years bringing poetry to life in a classroom just across town. What began as a simple request to hear one final poem would spiral into something neither man could have anticipated, touching hundreds of lives and proving that even in life's twilight, the power of words can illuminate the darkest corners of human experience. What happened in that room that day? The answer will change how you think about legacy forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tau. Memphis afternoon hung heavy with late summer heat as Morgan Freeman's car wound through the quiet streets of East Memphis. His driver, Marcus, had taken the long route to avoid the usual crowd of tourists around Beale Street. Morgan sat in the back, reading through a script for his next documentary project, when his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "Mr. Freeman, there's something you should see," the text read, followed by a link to a local news article. Headline caught his eye: "Beloved English Teacher's Final Poetry Class." Below it was a photograph of a thin, dignified man in his 70s, sitting in a hospice bed surrounded by former students. They were all holding worn poetry books, and despite the setting, there was something undeniably powerful about the image. Morgan clicked the link, adjusting his reading glasses. The story spoke of James Sullivan, a teacher who had spent 4 decades at East High School, inspiring generations of students through the power of poetry. Now, in his final days, those same students were returning to share verses with him, creating what they called the last poetry circle. "Marcus," Morgan called to his driver, "make a turn at the next light, we're taking a detour." "Sir?" Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Morgan's eye. "Cornerstone Hospice. You know it?" "Yes, sir. About 10 minutes from here." Morgan hadn't planned this stop. He had a meeting with his production team in an hour, but something about Sullivan's story pulled at him. Perhaps it was the way the article described the teacher's dedication to literature, or maybe it was the memory of his own high school English teacher, Mrs. Peterson, who had first introduced him to the transformative power of words. The hospice facility stood apart from the surrounding medical buildings, its brick facade softened by well-tended gardens and mature oak trees. As Morgan stepped out of the car, a warm breeze carried the scent of late-blooming jasmine. A few people near the entrance did double takes, but the staff maintained professional composure as he approached the front desk. "I'm here to see James Sullivan," he said quietly. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up and managed to hide her surprise well. "Are you expected?" "No, ma'am. But I'd like to see him if possible." She made a quick call, speaking in hushed tones, then nodded. "Room 217, Dr. Chen would like to speak with you first." Dr. Emily Chen met him in the hallway, her white coat pristine, her manner direct but gentle. "Mr. Freeman, this is unexpected. Mr. Sullivan is having one of his better days, but I should warn you, he's quite weak. We're managing his pain, but—" "I understand," Morgan replied. "I read about his poetry circles. Thought I might stop by." Dr. Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly. "He's been remarkable. Even now, he insists on teaching. Yesterday, he gave a lesson on Walt Whitman to 3 of his former students who are now teachers themselves." They paused outside room 217. Through the half-open door, Morgan could hear a voice, weak but clear, reciting familiar lines. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." "Dylan Thomas," Morgan murmured. "His favorite," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Shall I introduce you?" Inside the room, James Sullivan sat propped up against pillows, an oxygen tube beneath his nose. but his eyes were bright and alert. A woman in her 40s, his daughter Sarah, Morgan would later learn, sat beside him holding a well-worn poetry anthology. They both looked up as Dr. Chen entered with Morgan. James Sullivan's reaction wasn't what Morgan expected. There was surprise, yes, but it was tempered by something else. A teacher's analytical gaze, perhaps, as if he were more interested in understanding the moment than being impressed by it. "Well," Sullivan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I suppose if we're discussing Dylan Thomas, who better to join us than the voice of God himself?" The ice was broken. Sarah stood, clearly stunned, but her father remained composed, gesturing to an empty chair with a slightly trembling hand. "Please," he said, "we were just debating the true meaning of Thomas's rage against the dying of the light. Care to weigh in?" And just like that, Morgan Freeman found himself in an impromptu poetry discussion with a dying English teacher and his daughter. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from Welsh poets to the power of verbal interpretation. Sullivan spoke with the passion of someone who had spent his life illuminating the beauty of words for others. "You know," Sullivan said during a pause, "I've spent 40 years trying to teach young people that poetry isn't just words on a page. It's alive. It breathes. It changes with each voice that gives it life." He stopped, catching his breath, and Sarah quickly adjusted his oxygen. "I've always believed," Morgan responded. "That's why poetry needs to be heard, not just read." Sullivan's eyes lit up. "Exactly. That's what I've been telling my students for decades. There's something magical about the right voice bringing the right words to life at the right moment." He paused again, longer this time, and Morgan could see the effort it took for him to continue. Sarah watched her father with a mixture of concern and pride. "Mr. Freeman," Sullivan said finally, "I know this may seem forward, but would you consider reading something? Any poem? Your choice. I've spent my life sharing poetry with others. I'd like to experience it one last time through your voice." The request hung in the air, simple yet profound. Morgan looked at this man who had dedicated his life to teaching others the power of words, now asking for one final lesson in return. "I'd be honored," Morgan replied, "but I think you should choose the poem." Sullivan smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to erase years of illness from his face. He turned to Sarah, who was already reaching for the anthology they'd been reading earlier. "Page 147, Sullivan said. "Ozymandias. It seems appropriate." Sarah handed the book to Morgan, who took it carefully, noting the dog-eared pages and margin notes accumulated over decades of teaching. He found the page, cleared his throat, and began to read. "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 'Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert.' As Morgan's voice filled the small room, something extraordinary happened. The beeping of medical equipment seemed to fade away. The institutional fluorescent lighting seemed to soften. Sullivan closed his eyes, his expression peaceful, transported by the familiar words given new life through Morgan's distinctive voice. When the final lines faded, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains." There was a moment of perfect silence. Sullivan opened his eyes, and Morgan was startled to see tears there. "Thank you," the teacher whispered. That was exactly how poetry should be." Before Morgan could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A young nurse poked her head in, apologetically announcing it was time for Sullivan's medication. Morgan stood to leave, but Sullivan caught his sleeve with surprising strength. Would you consider coming back? There are so many poems we could discuss, so many interpretations to explore." Morgan looked at his watch, thought about his schedule, about the meetings and commitments that filled his days. Then he looked at Sullivan's face, at the passion for poetry that still burned bright despite his failing body. "Same time tomorrow," Morgan suggested. Sullivan's face lit up. "Bring your favorite poem, I'll bring mine. We'll have a proper poetry session." As Morgan left the hospice that afternoon, he found himself reciting poetry under his breath. Fragments of verses he hadn't thought about in years floating back to the surface of his memory. He had come here on an impulse, drawn by a simple news story. He was leaving with something far more valuable, a reminder of why he had fallen in love with words in the first place. What he didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. The simple act of reading a poem to a dying teacher would set in motion a chain of events that would touch hundreds of lives and remind everyone involved about the enduring power of human connection. Marcus was waiting by the car, curious but discreet. "Everything all right, Mr. Freeman?" Morgan nodded, looking back at the hospice building. "Everything's perfect, Marcus. We'll be coming back tomorrow. I need to find my old poetry books tonight." As they drove away, Morgan found himself thinking about legacy, about the ripples we create in the lives of others, often without realizing it. James Sullivan had spent decades nurturing the love of poetry in countless students. Now, in his final days, that love was coming back to him in ways he couldn't have imagined. The afternoon sun was setting over Memphis, casting long shadows across the city. Morgan pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next few days," he said. "Something more important has come up." That evening, Morgan sat in his study, surrounded by books he hadn't opened in years. His assistant, Linda, had helped him dig out old poetry collections from his personal library. Some still had his own margin notes from acting classes decades ago. "I haven't seen you this excited about a project in years," Linda observed, placing a cup of tea on his desk. "This isn't a project," Morgan replied, carefully turning the pages of a weathered anthology. "This is something else." He paused on a page marked with an old photograph, his high school drama club performing Death of a Salesman. The memory of those first moments on stage, discovering the power of words, came rushing back. "You know, Linda, I've narrated hundreds of stories, documentaries, played countless roles. But sometimes the simplest things are the most meaningful. Today, reading that poem, it felt like coming full circle." Linda sat down across from him, intrigued. "Tell me about him." "This teacher." Morgan leaned back, considering. "He reminds me of every great teacher I've ever had. The ones who see beyond the surface, who understand that education isn't just about facts and figures. It's about touching souls." He picked up another book, this one filled with contemporary poetry. "His daughter Sarah told me something interesting while you were making arrangements with the hospice. Apparently Sullivan never stopped teaching, even after retirement. He started a community poetry program, free classes for anyone who wanted to learn. Kids from tough neighborhoods, elderly folks from retirement homes, anyone who showed interest." "Sounds like someone else I know," Linda smiled, nodding toward the wall where Morgan's Charitable Foundation awards hung. "The difference is, he did it without recognition, without resources. Just pure passion for sharing knowledge." Morgan stood, walking to his window overlooking the Memphis skyline. "You know what really got me? The way his former students talk about him. They don't just remember what he taught them, they remember how he made them feel about themselves." The night deepened as Morgan continued his preparation, selecting poems that spoke to different aspects of life, death, and legacy. He found himself making notes just as he did for film roles, but this felt more personal, more vital somehow. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Sullivan. "Dad's really excited about tomorrow. He's been quoting poetry all evening. The nurses say they haven't seen him this energized in weeks. Thank you." Morgan typed back. "The honor is mine. Get some rest." But rest didn't come easily that night. Morgan kept thinking about Sullivan's story, about the lives he'd touched, about the power of words to bridge gaps between people. He thought about his own journey, from a kid in Mississippi, dreaming of being an actor, to becoming one of the most recognized voices in the world. As he finally drifted off to sleep, lines from various poems swirled in his mind, mixing with memories of teachers who had believed in him, of moments when words had changed the course of his life. The next morning, Morgan arrived at the hospice earlier than planned. He carried a leather bag filled with carefully selected poetry books, each marked with passages he wanted to discuss. The facility was quieter at this hour, the halls less crowded. As he approached room 217, he heard voices. Sullivan was already Holding court, speaking softly but passionately to what sounded like a small group. Morgan paused outside the door, listening. Poetry, Sullivan was saying, is not about the words on the page. It's about the spaces between the words, the things left unsaid, the echoes that remain after the last line fades. Morgan smiled, recognizing the truth in those words. He was about to enter when Dr. Chen appeared beside him. Mr. Freeman, before you go in, there's something you should know. The tone of her voice made him turn. What is it? Mr. Sullivan's condition. It's deteriorating faster than we expected. Last night's energy spike. It's not uncommon in terminal patients. Sometimes they rally before. She left the sentence unfinished. Morgan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was saying. How long? Days, maybe less. But having you here, this poetry project, it's giving him something to hold on to. Sometimes that's the greatest gift we can offer. With this new knowledge, Morgan took a deep breath and entered the room. The scene before him would stay in his memory forever. Sullivan, somehow looking both frailer and more alive than yesterday, surrounded by 3 former students and Sarah, all holding poetry books, all leaning in to catch his every word. When Sullivan saw Morgan, his face lit up with the pure joy of a teacher welcoming an eager student. Ah, the voice of God arrives. Now we can begin our real poetry session. And in that moment, Morgan Freeman, who had played presidents and prisoners, gods and gravediggers, understood that he was about to take part in something more powerful than any film scene he had ever shot. What happened next would transform a simple poetry reading into something that would touch lives across the country. As Morgan settled into the chair beside Sullivan's bed, Sarah quietly excused herself, ushering out the other visitors. Dad needs to conserve his energy, she explained, but her eyes told a different story. She knew this moment deserved its own space. I brought something special, Morgan said, reaching into his leather bag. He pulled out a first edition of Langston Hughes's collected works, its spine cracked with age. Sullivan's eyes widened. Is that 1959 edition? Morgan confirmed. Found it in a small bookstore in Harlem years ago. But before he could open it, Sullivan raised a trembling hand. Wait. Before we begin, I have a confession to make. He paused, gathering strength. I didn't just ask you here to read poetry. Morgan leaned forward, intrigued. The medical equipment beeped softly in the background as Sullivan continued. For 40 years, I've taught students that poetry isn't just about beautiful words. It's about truth. Raw, honest truth. He stopped, catching his breath. And I've been sitting on a truth that needs to be told. From beneath his pillow, Sullivan pulled out a worn leather journal. This contains something I've never shared with anyone. Not even Sarah knows about it. His hands shook as he held it out. It's a poem I wrote every day during the Vietnam War. One poem, every single day. For 2 years, 7 months, and 14 days. Morgan took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of history in its pages. Why are you showing me this now? Because poetry needs the right voice to bring it to life. And these poems, they're not just about war. They're about what happens to the human soul when it's pushed to its limits, about how we find beauty in darkness, hope in despair. Sullivan's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I've spent my life teaching other people's poetry. But these words, they're my truth. And I want you to be their voice. As Morgan opened the journal, the first entry hit him like a physical force. June 15th, 1968. Saigon bleeds tonight, not with bombs or bullets, but with whispered prayers in languages I'll never understand for children I'll never meet. There are hundreds more, Sullivan said softly, each one a piece of what we lost over there, what we found, what we can never forget. Morgan turned page after page, each poem a raw snapshot of war, humanity, and survival. Some were just a few lines, written in shaking handwriting that suggested they were composed under fire. Others filled entire pages with carefully crafted verses that spoke of longing, fear, and unexpected moments of grace. Why haven't you shared these before? Sullivan's answer came slowly. Fear, maybe. Or shame. How do you tell beautiful stories about ugly things? How do you make poetry from pain? Just then, Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. Time for medication, she announced, but stopped short when she saw the intensity on their faces. I can come back. No, Sullivan said. I need to stay clear for this. He turned back to Morgan. These poems, they're not just about Vietnam. They're about every war, every struggle. About how humanity survives its darkest moments. They need to be heard now more than ever. As the doctor administered Sullivan's medication, Morgan continued reading. One entry particularly caught his eye. December 25th, 1969. We sang carols in the jungle tonight. Silent night in whispered tones, while tracers painted Christmas stars across the sky, and somewhere on both sides of this line we've drawn Mothers Pray for Peace. This is powerful stuff, Mr. Sullivan, Morgan said finally. But what exactly are you asking? Sullivan sat up straighter, energy seeming to flow back into his thin frame. I want you to help me turn these into something more, not just a book. Anyone can publish a book. I want to create a project that brings poetry back to the people who need it most. Veterans, students, anyone who's ever felt lost or voiceless. A poetry project? More than that. A movement. These poems, they're not just about war, they're about healing, about finding beauty in broken places, about how words can build bridges between people who think they have nothing in common. Morgan sat back, understanding, dawning. This wasn't just about reading poetry anymore. This was about legacy, about transformation, about using art to change lives. I'm dying, Mr. Freeman, Sullivan said matter-of-factly. But these words don't have to die with me. With your voice, your platform, imagine how many people we could reach, how many lives we could touch. The moment was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Sarah had returned, accompanied by a tall man in military dress uniform. Dad, she said, look who I found in the parking lot. Colonel Richards heard you were here. The colonel stepped forward, his bearings straight, despite his obvious age. James Sullivan, he said, voice thick with emotion. After all these years, Sullivan's face lit up with recognition. Tommy Richards. My God. Morgan watched as the two men clasped hands, decades falling away in an instant. You two know each other? Sarah asked. Know each other? Colonel Richards laughed. Your father saved my life in '69. Not just physically, though he did that too. But it was his words that really saved me. Those poems he used to write. Sullivan's eyes widened. You remembered? Remembered? Hell, I still have some of them memorized. That one you wrote after the Tet Offensive. About the sunrise over the rice paddies? It got me through some dark nights. Morgan looked between the two men, seeing the project Sullivan had proposed taking on new dimensions. This wasn't just about preserving memories. It was about healing wounds that had never fully closed. Colonel Richards turned to Morgan, suddenly registering his presence. Mr. Freeman, what's going on here? Before anyone could respond, Sullivan had another coughing fit. Dr. Chen stepped forward, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. Perhaps we should continue this tomorrow, she suggested. Mr. Sullivan needs rest. But Sullivan waved her off. No, this is too important. He looked at Morgan intently. Now you see why these poems matter. They're not just my story, they're Tommy's story, and the story of countless others. Will you help me tell it? Morgan stood, mind already racing with possibilities. Mr. Sullivan, I'm not just going to help you tell it. We're going to make sure it changes lives. As if on cue, Sarah pulled out her phone. Dad, you're not going to believe this. That local news article about your poetry classes, it just went viral. People are sharing their own stories about teachers who changed their lives. There's even a hashtag, Yearn Sullivan's Poets. Sullivan smiled weakly. See? The world is ready for this. We just need to give them the words. Morgan looked at the journal in his hands, then at the small group gathered in the room. The dying teacher, his devoted daughter, the veteran whose life had been touched by poetry, the dedicated doctor. Each of them represented a thread in a larger tapestry, a story that needed to be told. "Tomorrow," Morgan said firmly, "I'm bringing my production team. We're going to do this right. These poems, your story, they deserve more than just a reading. They deserve to be heard by everyone who's ever felt lost, everyone who's ever needed words to light their way through darkness." As he left the hospice that evening, Morgan could feel the weight of the journal in his bag, could hear Sullivan's poems echoing in his mind. He knew that tomorrow would bring challenges, that time was working against them, that turning this vision into reality would require more than just good intentions. But he also knew that sometimes the most powerful stories start in the quietest moments with simple truths spoken in whispered tones. And as he drove home through the Memphis night, Morgan Freeman began to plan how to turn a dying teacher's final wish into a legacy that would touch lives for generations to come. Back in his car, Morgan made a series of rapid-fire calls. First, to his production company, then to his foundation director, and finally to Linda. "Cancel everything for the next week," he instructed. Something bigger than all of it just came up. Linda, used to Morgan's occasional bursts of inspiration, didn't question it. "What do you need? Get me Keith Harrison from PBS on the line, and find out who handles Veteran Affairs programming. Also, I need our best videographer, someone who understands the power of quiet moments." As Morgan spoke, he was already envisioning how to capture not just Sullivan's poems but the essence of what made them powerful, the way they bridged generations, healed wounds, connected disparate lives through shared experiences. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad's resting now, but he keeps talking about tomorrow. Thank you for giving him this hope." Morgan thought about Sullivan's words about truth and poetry, about finding beauty in broken places. He thought about Colonel Richards and the poems that had gotten him through dark nights. An idea began to form. That night, Morgan sat in his study until dawn, reading through Sullivan's journal. The poems told a story larger than one man's war experience. They were a testament to humanity's resilience, to the power of words to heal and transform. One entry particularly stood out. March 3rd, 1969. "Today I watched a young man die. He couldn't have been more than 20 in his pocket. A letter from home, unfinished verses in the margins. Even here in this hell, someone was trying to make sense through poetry." Morgan read it aloud, letting his voice give weight to each word. This wasn't just about preserving memories. It was about showing how art could save lives, how words could build bridges across the deepest divides. By morning, he had a clear vision. This wouldn't just be a reading or a simple documentary. It would be something new. A fusion of poetry, personal history, and healing. A way to show that every life contains poetry, if only we have the courage to find it. He arrived at the hospice just as the sun was rising, accompanied by a small but skilled production team. They had been briefed on the sensitivity of the situation. No large cameras, no intrusive lighting. Nothing that would disturb the peaceful atmosphere of Sullivan's room. Sarah met them in the hallway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dad, had a rough night?" she whispered. "But he's been waiting for you. He says he has more to share." Inside the room, Sullivan looked frailer than yesterday, but his eyes still burned with purpose. The journal lay open on his lap, and beside his bed sat Colonel Richards, who had apparently spent the night sharing memories and verses. "You came back," Sullivan said, his voice barely a whisper. "With reinforcements," Morgan replied, gesturing to his team. "If you're still willing to share your story, we're ready to help you tell it." Sullivan nodded slowly. "There's something else you need to see." He motioned to Sarah, who pulled a box from under his bed. Inside were hundreds of letters yellowed with age. "These are from my students," Sullivan explained. "Every student who ever told me that poetry saved their life. Every veteran who found their voice through words. Every person who discovered they weren't alone because someone else had put their pain into verses." Morgan picked up one of the letters, reading it carefully. It was from a former student, now a teacher herself. describing how Sullivan's poetry classes had given her the strength to escape an abusive home. Another was from a Vietnam veteran who had taken Sullivan's community college class in the 1980s. "Your poems about the war," he wrote, "said everything I could never tell my family. They helped me find my way home." As Morgan read, Sullivan continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with purpose. "These letters, they're proof that poetry isn't just about pretty words. It's about survival, about finding light in darkness, about building bridges between hearts that think they're alone." The production team had begun setting up their equipment, working quietly and respectfully. Their small cameras captured the morning light filtering through the window, the way it illuminated the scattered papers and books, the intimate gathering of souls, brought together by the power of words. "What exactly do you want to create?" Morgan asked, though he was already forming his own vision. Sullivan's answer came with surprising clarity. "I want to show that poetry isn't just for academics or artists. It's for the soldier trying to make sense of war. It's for the teenager feeling lost and alone. It's for anyone who ever needed words to light their way through darkness." Colonel Richards spoke up from his chair. "Tell him about the letters from the prison, James." Sullivan smiled weakly. "After I retired, I started teaching poetry in the state prison. Hardened men, some serving life sentences. You know what they told me? That finding their voice through poetry made them feel human again, made them remember who they were before the darkness took them." Morgan nodded, understanding growing. This wasn't just about preserving one man's legacy, it was about showing how art could transform lives, how words could reach across any barrier, heal any wound. "We start today," Morgan declared. "But we do this right. Not just readings, not just memories. We show the world how poetry saves lives." The next 48 hours transformed Room 217 into something between a recording studio and a sacred space. Morgan's production team, led by cinematographer Rachel Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, worked with almost reverent discretion, capturing moments without disturbing them. "The key," Morgan explained to his team, "is to let the story tell itself. We're not making a documentary, we're witnessing a resurrection." The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. While setting up equipment, they overheard a conversation between Sullivan and his night nurse, Bobby Washington. Bobby, it turned out, had been writing his own poetry for years, inspired by the late-night conversations he'd had with Sullivan during his shifts. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Show them, Bobby," Sullivan encouraged. "Show them the one about your grandfather." Bobby, a tall man with gentle hands, pulled a creased paper from his scrub's pocket and began to read. Grandpa's hands spoke languages that his mouth never learned, calluses like consonants, scars that spelled out stories of cotton fields and freedom dreams. His silence was a poem I'm still trying to understand. The room fell silent when he finished. Morgan exchanged glances with Rachel, who had quietly captured the moment on camera. "That's it," Morgan said softly. "That's what this project needs to be. Not just about Mr. Sullivan's poems, but about how poetry creates ripples through generations." The project began to take shape organically. Sarah started reaching out to her father's former students, and the response was overwhelming. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, factory workers, people from all walks of life began sending videos of themselves reading poems that Sullivan had helped them discover or create. One particularly moving submission came from Maria Gonzalez, now a Supreme Court judge who had been in Sullivan's class in 1985. She read the poem she'd written in his class after her parents were deported. "English sits heavy on my tongue like borrowed clothes, but in your classroom, words become wings and I learn to fly." As these submissions poured in, Sullivan's strength seemed to rally. He insisted on recording his own introductions to each segment, though Dr. Chen warned them to be mindful of his energy levels. "Poetry," Sullivan explained during one recording session, "isn't about being clever with words. It's about being honest with your soul. Every student who ever sat in my classroom taught me that truth." Morgan watched as Sullivan worked with each visitor, each submission, treating every poem like a precious gift. Despite his failing health, his mind remained sharp, his teacher's instincts intact. The project evolved beyond their initial concept. What had started as a simple reading of Vietnam War poems was becoming a tapestry of interconnected stories, showing how words could heal wounds, bridge divides, and illuminate dark corners of human experience. Colonel Richards became a regular presence, often bringing other veterans who had their own stories to share. One afternoon, he arrived with a group of young soldiers from the local VA hospital, each carrying poems written during their tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Different war, same human heart, Sullivan observed as they shared their verses. The most unexpected development came when Bobby shared Sullivan's impact with other hospice workers. Soon, nurses, orderlies, and even doctors began sharing how working with dying patients had inspired their own poetry. Dr. Chen herself revealed a collection of haiku she'd written about her patients. Last breath approaches, family gathers like leaves around autumn's end. Morgan's production team captured it all, working around the clock in shifts to ensure no meaningful moment was missed. Rachel developed a technique she called whisper filming, using minimal equipment to maintain the intimate atmosphere while documenting everything. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Sullivan's health fluctuated dramatically. Some days he could barely speak above a whisper. Other times, pain medication made him too groggy to focus. Yet even in these moments, they found poetry. During one particularly difficult afternoon, when Sullivan was struggling with pain, Sarah began reading from his Vietnam journal. The entry was from a similar moment of suffering. Pain has its own poetry, a rhythm of sharp and dull, a melody of nerve and bone, teaching me that even agony can be transformed into song. The project began attracting attention beyond their initial circle. Local news picked up the story, then national outlets. Sullivan's poets trended on social media. People began sharing their own stories of teachers who had changed their lives through poetry. Morgan's foundation received calls from schools across the country, asking about starting poetry programs. Veterans organizations reached out about using poetry for PTSD therapy. Prison education programs wanted to know more about Sullivan's methods. "See what you've started?" Morgan said to Sullivan during a quiet moment between recordings. "Your ripples are becoming waves." Sullivan smiled weakly. "Poetry has always been about connection. We just needed to remind people of that truth." The breakthrough moment came on day 3. They were recording Sullivan's introduction to his Vietnam poems when Colonel Richards arrived with an unexpected guest, Jimmy Martinez, the soldier mentioned in Sullivan's March 3, 1969 poem about the young man with unfinished verses. "He didn't die that day," Richards explained. "Sullivan thought he had, but we got him out. He's been writing poetry ever since." Martinez, now gray-haired but standing straight, approached Sullivan's bed. "You don't remember me, sir, but I remember the poem you wrote while you thought I was dying. Someone showed it to me years later." Sullivan stared at him, tears forming in his eyes. "All these years, I've carried that moment with me." "So have I," Martinez replied, pulling out a worn notebook. "These are all the poems I've written since that day. Because even though I was unconscious, somehow your words reached me. They gave me a reason to keep living, keep writing." The reunion was captured on film, though Rachel had to stop several times to wipe her own eyes. The moment crystallized everything their project was about. The unexpected ways that poetry connects lives, spans decades, heals wounds. That evening, after most of the team had left, Morgan sat with Sullivan reviewing footage on a laptop. Despite his exhaustion, Sullivan insisted on seeing how the project was taking shape. "It's becoming something more than we planned," Morgan observed. Sullivan nodded. "It's becoming what it needs to be. Poetry has a way of finding its own path." They watched clips of former students sharing their stories, of veterans reading their poems, of healthcare workers finding beauty in their difficult work, each story connected to others, creating a web of shared human experience. "You know what this reminds me of?" Sullivan said, his voice barely a whisper. "Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Not just one voice, but many voices. Not just one story, but the story of us all. Morgan looked at the frail man in the hospital bed, seeing beyond the illness to the teacher who had touched so many lives. "That's what we'll call it," he said. "Songs of ourselves. Not just your poems, but everyone's poems, everyone's stories." Sullivan smiled, his eyes closing with fatigue. "Perfect. Because that's what poetry really is. The song of human hearts finding each other in the darkness." As Sullivan drifted off to sleep, Morgan sat in the quiet room, listening to the gentle beep of medical equipment, thinking about the unexpected turns this project had taken. What had started as a simple request to read a poem had become something far more profound, a testament to the power of words to connect, heal, and transform. The next morning brought new challenges and unexpected gifts. A group of Sullivans, former students, now teachers themselves, had organized a virtual poetry reading with their current classes. Students from across the country would be reading poems inspired by Sullivan's teaching methods. "It's like watching your garden grow," Sullivan remarked as they set up the video conference. Seeds planted decades ago still bearing fruit. The first student to read was a 16-year-old from Detroit, her voice clear and confident. "My grandmother's accent is a map of places I've never been, each syllable a star guiding me home." Sullivan listened intently, his oxygen mask temporarily set aside. "You hear that imagery?" he whispered to Morgan. "That's pure truth there. No artifice, just heart." Throughout the day, more stories emerged. A janitor from Sullivan's old school revealed how he'd overheard Sullivan's poetry classes while cleaning and had been secretly writing his own verses for 20 years. A former student, now a renowned surgeon, shared how poetry helped him maintain his humanity during difficult operations. The production team worked tirelessly, weaving these threads into the larger tapestry of their project. Rachel developed a signature style for these recordings, intimate, almost prayer-like in their quietness, yet vibrating with emotional energy. During a brief break, Morgan found himself in conversation with Dr. Chen about the project's impact on Sullivan's health. "Medically speaking, he should be much weaker," she admitted. "But I've seen this before. When patients find purpose, when they know their legacy will live on, it gives them strength we can't explain." The afternoon brought another surprise. A group of inmates from the state prison where Sullivan had taught had received permission to send video messages. Their poems spoke of redemption, of finding humanity in the darkest places. Between these concrete walls, words become windows. Through them, I see the man I might have been, the man I might still be. Sullivan insisted on recording responses to each submission, though the effort clearly drained him. "Every voice matters," he said when Morgan suggested he rest. "Every story deserves to be heard." As evening approached, Sarah discovered a box of old photographs in Sullivan's classroom at East High. Among them was a picture from 1969, Sullivan, with his platoon in Vietnam, each man holding a copy of Leaves of Grass. "We took turns reading it during downtime," Colonel Richards explained, examining the photo. "Your father said poetry would keep us human, even in inhuman conditions." The photograph sparked a new dimension to their project. Morgan's team began incorporating archival footage, creating a visual journey through time, showing how Sullivan's love of poetry had touched lives across decades and continents. "It's like watching ripples in a pond," Morgan observed. Each poem, each story, creating waves that touch distant shores. Late that night, after most of the team had left, Sullivan asked Morgan to read one more poem from his Vietnam journal. His voice was weak, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "Tonight I understand that words are not just marks on paper, they are bridges between souls, lifelines in the darkness, maps for lost hearts finding their way home." As Morgan's voice filled the quiet room, both men understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a testament to the enduring power of human connection through words. The project took an unexpected turn on the fourth day when Sullivan's fever spiked dramatically. Dr. Chen considered halting the recordings, but Sullivan insisted on continuing, even if only for short periods. Time, he whispered to Morgan during one of his more lucid moments, is becoming a precious commodity. We need to use it wisely. It was during this period of uncertainty that the project revealed its deepest layers. Sarah, spending sleepless nights at her father's bedside, discovered a hidden compartment in his old briefcase. Inside was a collection of letters that would change everything. "Dad," she said, holding up the yellowed envelopes. "What are these?" Sullivan's eyes flickered with recognition. "Ah," he breathed. "The letters from the other side." The letters, it turned out, were from North Vietnamese soldiers, correspondence that had begun in the late 1980s when Sullivan's first collection of war poems had been unofficially translated and shared in Hanoi. Morgan read one of the translations aloud. "Dear Teacher Sullivan, your words about the rice paddies at dawn could have been written by my brother who never came home. Perhaps you and he saw the same sunrise from different sides of the same war. Poetry knows no enemies." The discovery sparked a new dimension to their project. Through Sarah's connections at the university, they located several of the Vietnamese correspondents. Within hours, video calls were being arranged across time zones. The first call was with Nguyen Van Minh, now a literature professor in Hanoi. His face on the screen was elderly but animated as he shared his story through an interpreter. "When I first read Mr. Sullivan's poems, I was angry. How dare an American capture our pain so accurately? But then I realized he wasn't writing about American pain or Vietnamese pain. He was writing about human pain, about human hope." Sullivan, despite his fever, insisted on participating in these calls. Each conversation revealed new layers of healing that his poetry had facilitated across former battle lines. The production team worked around the clock to incorporate these international elements. Rachel developed a visual style that emphasized the similarities in human expression across cultures, the same look of revelation in eyes separated by languages and borders. During one particularly powerful session, they connected with a poetry group in Ho Chi Minh City, where Sullivan's Vietnam poems were being used to help young people understand their grandparents' experiences of the war. Young Vietnamese student read her response poem. "In my grandmother's garden, American bombs once fell. Now flowers bloom, in craters that have become ponds where peace floats like lotus blossoms." Sullivan wept openly at hearing these words. "This," he said, gripping Morgan's hand, "this is why poetry matters. It turns battlefields into gardens." The fever made Sullivan drift in and out of consciousness, but even in his less lucid moments, he continued to teach. His mumbled words were often fragments of poems, instructions to invisible students, or new verses emerging from his delirium. "In fever dreams I see all the faces blend, enemy and friend, becoming one humanity. Seeking words for peace," Morgan's team captured these moments with gentle discretion, understanding that they were witnessing something rare, a poet's mind continuing to create even as his body failed. The project's scope continued to expand. Veterans groups across the country began organizing poetry workshops based on Sullivan's methods. Schools started incorporating his story into their literature programs. Prison writing programs requested copies of his teaching materials, but it was the personal moments that proved most powerful. Bobby, the night nurse, shared how Sullivan had helped him process his own father's death through poetry. "Each night shift, I watch over others' endings, learning how to say goodbye in languages of care and silence." Dr. Chen revealed that she had begun encouraging other hospice patients to write, having seen the therapeutic effect on Sullivan. "Poetry," she observed, "gives people a way to face the ultimate transition with dignity and purpose." The fever broke on the 5th day, leaving Sullivan weaker but more determined. During his first clear moment, he asked Morgan to bring him his Vietnam journal. "There's something I never finished," he said, his voice barely audible. "A poem I started in '69 but couldn't complete. I think I know how it ends now." Morgan held the journal steady as Sullivan dictated, "War taught me this, that beauty persists even in broken places, that words can bridge what bullets divide, that every ending contains seeds of beginning." The production. team had by now accumulated over 100 hours of footage. Interviews, readings, reactions, connections. The challenge was no longer gathering material, but deciding how to shape it. It's like a poem itself, Morgan reflected during an editorial meeting, finding the right form for truth. They began organizing the material into themes: war and peace, teaching and learning, life and death, connection and healing. But Sullivan had a different vision. Don't separate them, he insisted during a moment of clarity. Life doesn't happen in categories. Let it flow like consciousness, like memory, like poetry itself. This guidance led to a breakthrough in the project's structure. Instead of a traditional documentary format, they began crafting something more fluid, a weaving of voices, times, and perspectives, all connected by the thread of human experience expressed through words. The impact continued to spread. Sullivan's Poets had evolved into a global phenomenon, with people sharing their stories of transformation through poetry. Libraries reported increased requests for poetry collections. Writing groups formed spontaneously in communities across the country. A particularly moving development came when a group of Sullivan's former students, now working in various fields, started a foundation to support poetry programs in underserved schools. They named it the Sullivan Light, after one of his favorite teaching phrases. Poetry is a light that shows us who we really are. During a quiet moment between recordings, Morgan found Sullivan looking through old photographs. One showed him as a young teacher standing before his first class in 1970. I was so scared that day, Sullivan remembered. Scared that words wouldn't be enough to heal what the war had broken in me. But those students, they taught me that poetry isn't just about healing yourself. It's about creating spaces where others can heal too. The project was becoming more than a documentary about one man's life and poetry. It was evolving into a testament to the power of words to transform lives, to heal wounds, to build bridges across the deepest divides. As Sullivan's strength continued to fade, the urgency of their work increased, but so did its impact. Each day brought new stories of lives touched, connections made, healing begun. We're not just recording history, Morgan told his team. We're participating in something that's still growing, still creating ripples. Late one evening, as the production team was reviewing footage, an unexpected visitor arrived at the hospice. David Chen, Dr. Chen's teenage son, had come to share something with Sullivan. "Mr. Sullivan," he said nervously, "I heard you talking about poetry bridging generations. I wrote something about my mom's work here." Sullivan gestured for him to continue. The boy pulled out his phone and began to read. "My mother speaks in gentle codes, morphine drips and monitor beeps, but I see how she carries each goodbye home in her eyes, a dictionary of loss, teaching me what it means to live fully until the end." The room fell silent when he finished. Dr. Chen, who had entered quietly during the reading, wiped tears from her eyes. Sullivan reached for the boy's hand. "That," he said firmly, "is truth. That's what poetry does. It helps us see the beauty in even the hardest truths." The moment sparked a new thread in their project. They began gathering stories from healthcare workers' families, children, spouses, parents who watched their loved ones deal daily with death and still find beauty in life. Morgan's team captured these new perspectives, showing how poetry could illuminate the hidden emotional landscapes of everyday heroes. Rachel developed a special way of filming these family moments, using soft focus and natural light to create an intimate, almost sacred atmosphere. The project's scope continued to expand organically. A group of medical students, inspired by Dr. Chen's haiku, started a poetry therapy program at their hospital. Veterans began organizing poetry workshops in VA centers across the country. Prison writing programs requested Sullivan's teaching materials. During one particularly powerful session, they connected with a poetry group in a maximum security prison. The inmates had been studying Sullivan's Vietnam poems, finding parallels with their own experiences of confinement and redemption. One inmate, serving life for a crime committed in his youth, shared a poem that silenced the room. "Between these walls of stone and steel, I found words could set me free, not my body, bound by deed and time, but my soul, which learns to fly through spaces between the lines. Sullivan, though weakening, insisted on recording a response to each submission. Every voice matters, he repeated. Every story deserves to be heard. The project was no longer just about preserving one man's legacy. It had become a living testament to the power of words to transform lives, heal wounds, and build bridges across the deepest divides. As evening approached on their 5th day of filming, Sullivan asked Morgan to read one final poem from his Vietnam journal. His voice was weak, but his eyes burned with purpose. In the end, we are all students of the same light, learning to read shadows, finding our way home, through words that bridge the spaces between hearts. The room fell silent as Morgan's voice carried the words into the gathering darkness. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a testament to the enduring power of human connection through words. The morning of the 6th day brought a revelation that would change everything. As the production team was setting up their equipment, Sarah discovered a hidden compartment in her father's old desk that had been brought to the hospice room. Inside was a manuscript, not of poetry, but of classified military documents and a series of letters that would shake the foundation of their entire project. "Dad," Sarah's voice trembled as she held up the yellowed papers. "What are these?" Sullivan, who had been dozing, opened his eyes slowly. Seeing the documents in his daughter's hands, his face changed. For the first time since the project began, he looked afraid. "Those weren't supposed to be found," he whispered. "Not yet." Morgan, who had been reviewing footage nearby, noticed the sudden tension in the room. The production team sensed it too, cameras slowly lowering as they felt the shift in atmosphere. James, Colonel Richards, who had just arrived for his daily visit, stopped short when he saw the papers. "Are those?" Sullivan nodded weakly. "It's time," he said. "Morgan, you should read them. You need to understand what we're really preserving. Here." The documents revealed a stunning truth. Sullivan's poetry program hadn't just been about healing and education. It had been part of a classified military operation codenamed Project Verse. During the Vietnam War, Sullivan and a select group of soldiers had been tasked with using poetry as a means of encoding and transmitting sensitive intelligence. The poems weren't just poems, Sullivan explained, his voice gaining strength from the urgency of revelation. They were messages. Every verse about sunrise contained coordinates. Every metaphor about birds carried information about enemy movements. We used poetry because it was the last thing anyone would suspect. Morgan read, through the documents, his hands trembling slightly. The implications were staggering. Some of the most beloved poems from Sullivan's Vietnam journal, the ones that had touched so many lives, had actually been carefully crafted intelligence communications. But the healing. Morgan looked up, questioning. The impact on soldiers, on students, that was real, wasn't it? Sullivan smiled sadly. That's the miracle of poetry, isn't it? Truth works on many levels. Yes, the poems carried military intelligence, but they also carried human truth. The pain, the hope, the longing for peace. All of that was real. Colonel Richards moved to Sullivan's bedside. "I think it's time we told them the whole story, James." The room fell silent as Sullivan began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. The production team, sensing the historical importance of the moment, quietly resumed filming. Project Verse wasn't just about transmitting intelligence, Sullivan revealed. It was about something much bigger. We discovered that poetry, the act of creating it, sharing it, teaching it, had a unique power to maintain humanity in the midst of chaos. The military wanted to use that power. He paused, gathering strength. After the war, they didn't shut the program down. They evolved it. All those poetry classes I taught, the prison programs, the veteran workshops, they were part of a long-term study on using artistic expression for psychological healing and social reconstruction. Sarah sat heavily in a chair, trying to process this new understanding of her father's life work. All those students, all those lives you touched, were part of something larger than they knew, Sullivan finished. But that doesn't make their experiences any less real or valuable. In fact, it makes them more important. Morgan's mind raced as he thought about how this revelation would affect their project. The story they were telling had just become infinitely more complex. "There's more," Sullivan said, gesturing to another set of documents. Project Verse didn't end with Vietnam, it's still active. Those poetry programs starting up in VA hospitals, in prisons, in schools across the country, they're all part of. Had the military never stopped believing in the power of words to heal and transform? The production team looked at each other, stunned. Rachel's camera continued rolling, capturing this moment of revelation that would reshape their entire narrative. "But why reveal this now?" Morgan asked. Sullivan's answer came slowly, deliberately. "Because the project is evolving again. Those connections we've been making with Vietnam, the healing happening across old battle lines. It's opening doors that have been closed for 50 years. Poetry is doing what politics couldn't." He reached for a fresh page in his journal, his hand shaking but determined. "I need to write one more poem. One that tells the whole truth, about how art and intelligence, healing and warfare, love and strategy all intertwine. Will you help me, Morgan?" For the next hour, the room watched in reverent silence as Sullivan dictated and Morgan wrote, crafting a poem that would serve as both confession and celebration. In war's dark theater, we played dual roles, soldiers, of intelligence, warriors of the word, each verse a code, each metaphor a map. But in the spaces between secret messages and sacred truths, we found something more, a way to keep our souls alive when death walked among us like a familiar friend. Now, decades later, those same words still work. They're double magic. Healing wounds we never knew we shared, building bridges across chasms of time, teaching us that every act of creation is also an act of resistance against the chaos that threatens to unmake us all. As Morgan read the poem aloud, its multiple layers of meaning resonated through the room. It was both a revelation of classified history and a testament to the enduring power of artistic expression. "What do we do with this information?" Sarah asked, looking at the documents spread across her father's bed. "We tell the truth," Morgan replied, "but we tell it carefully. The story isn't just about secret operations anymore. It's about how something designed for war transformed into a force for peace." Sullivan nodded weakly. "The project was always about transformation. We just didn't know how many levels it would work on." The revelation sent ripples through the entire production team. Rachel immediately began reviewing their earlier footage, seeing it now through this new lens. Every interview, every shared poem, took on additional layers of meaning. "Look at this," she said, playing back footage of veterans sharing their poems. "They're not just processing trauma. They're part of a continuing mission. They're soldiers of words." Dr. Chen, who had entered during the revelation, stood quietly by the door. "I always wondered why the military was so interested in our poetry, therapy programs," she said. "Now I understand. We're not just treating individuals. We're part of a larger healing strategy." Sullivan's fever returned as evening approached, but this time his delirious mumblings took on new significance. What had seemed like random poetry fragments now appeared to be possible code phrases. "Moonlight on Delta waters. 3 birds flying west, time flows like river mud. Through careful fingers." Colonel Richards listened intently, taking notes. "Even now," he whispered to Morgan, "even after all these years, the old codes are still there." But the biggest shock came when Sarah, continuing to go through the documents, found a list of names, prominent figures in politics, arts, and education, who had all been part of Project Verse. "Dad," she gasped, "these people, they're all leaders," Sullivan finished weakly. "People who learned that the best way to fight darkness is to create light. People who understood that poetry could change the world in ways that weapons never could." Morgan sat quietly, absorbing the implications. Their simple documentary about a dying teacher's poetry had just become something far more complex, a story about the intersection of art and intelligence, about how creativity could be both a weapon and a healing tool. "The question is," he said finally, "how do we tell this story without compromising current operations?" without endangering the work that's still being done? Sullivan struggled to sit up, his voice gaining strength from urgency. That's why I chose you, Morgan. Your voice, it has the power to tell truth on multiple levels, to reveal without exposing, to illuminate without burning. The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the weight of this responsibility. The project had become more than just a documentary. It was now a crucial part of a decades-long mission to transform the tools of war into instruments of peace. There's one more thing, Colonel Richards said, pulling out his phone. Those poetry groups we've been connecting with in Vietnam, they're not just random literature enthusiasts. They're our counterparts, former North Vietnamese intelligence officers who also use poetry as code. They've been waiting years for this moment, for the chance to acknowledge this shared history. As if on cue, Sullivan's laptop chimed with an incoming video call. On the screen appeared an elderly Vietnamese man, his face lined with age but his eyes bright with purpose. "Teacher Sullivan," he said, in careful English. "It is time, yes? Time for the final verse?" The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to reveal its true dimensions. The revelation of Project Verse created an immediate urgency in room 217. Sullivan's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and now they weren't just racing against time to preserve poetry, they were working to document a classified program that had shaped international relations for decades. "We need to do this right," Morgan said, gathering his core team. "Every decision we make now affects not just Sullivan's legacy, but potentially national security and ongoing peace initiatives." The Vietnamese contact on the video call identified himself as Colonel Nguyen Van Minh, the same literature professor they'd spoken with earlier, but now revealed as a former intelligence officer who had run North Vietnam's parallel poetry program. "For 50 years, Minh explained through the screen, we have waited for this moment, the time when both sides could acknowledge how poetry became a bridge between enemies." Sullivan, despite his weakening condition, insisted on being part of every discussion. His bed had become the command center of an extraordinary operation, part documentary production, part historical revelation, part international peace initiative, the Miao poems. He whispered to Morgan during a quiet moment. They were never just codes. That's what the military never fully understood. We weren't just transmitting intelligence, we were transmitting humanity. Sarah, still processing the truth about her father's work, discovered more documents that revealed the full scope of Project Verse. The program hadn't ended with Vietnam. It had evolved, spreading into other conflict zones, using poetry as a tool for both intelligence and reconciliation. "Look at these," she said, spreading papers across Sullivan's bed. "Bosnia, Rwanda, Afghanistan. Poetry programs in every major conflict zone of the last 50 years. All connected, all part of the same mission." The production team worked frantically to reorganize their material. Rachel's cameras captured the increasing intensity in room 217 as more players in this international drama emerged. Dr. Chen revealed that the hospice itself was no accident. "This facility," she explained, "has been a meeting point for former intelligence officers from various conflicts. Poetry therapy was our cover for continued diplomatic backchannels." The revelation explained the steady stream of international visitors Sullivan had received over the years, each bringing poems that now appeared to be more than mere verses. Morgan's phone buzzed constantly with calls from military officials, intelligence agencies, and diplomatic services, all concerned about what they planned to reveal. But Sullivan was adamant about the path forward. "The world needs to know this story," he insisted during a particularly difficult breathing spell. Not the classified details, but the truth about how art can transform conflict, how poetry can turn enemies into collaborators, soldiers into peacemakers. Colonel Richards arrived with a team of military archivists. They began the delicate process of determining what could be revealed while protecting ongoing operations. But Sullivan had his own ideas about what needed to be preserved. "The codes don't matter anymore," he told them. "What matters is the human connection that grew from them. How we learned to see each other as poets first, enemies second." As if to emphasize this point, more video calls began coming in from around the world. Former intelligence officers, now teachers, writers, and peace activists, each sharing how Project Verse had transformed their understanding of conflict and resolution. A former Bosnian operative, now running a multicultural poetry program in Sarajevo, shared his experience. "We began using poems to track troop movements. We ended up using them to rebuild trust between communities." An Afghan woman speaking from a girls' school in Kabul revealed how poetry circles had become safe spaces for peace negotiations. The Taliban commander and the local governor could not speak to each other directly, but they could share poems about their hopes for their grandchildren. The stories kept coming, each one revealing new layers of this decades-long initiative. Morgan's team worked around the clock, knowing they were documenting something unprecedented in military and cultural history. Sarah found herself reading, through years of her father's correspondence, seeing his simple English teacher's life transform into something far more complex and meaningful. "You were building peace while everyone else was preparing for war," she told him, holding his hand. Sullivan smiled weakly. "Poetry has always been about transformation. We just gave it a more direct purpose." The project's urgency increased as Sullivan's health declined. Dr. Chen warned them that they might have days, maybe only hours, to complete their documentation. But something extraordinary was happening. The more they revealed about Project Verse, the more energy Sullivan seemed to find. "It's like watching a weight lift from him," Dr. Chen observed, "as if keeping this secret had been holding him here. And now he can finally let go." Morgan worked with military officials to craft a narrative that would protect sensitive information while revealing the profound truth about poetry's role in international peacebuilding. The story was growing beyond anything they had initially imagined. Bobby, the night nurse who had shared his own poems earlier, revealed that he too had been part of the program, his position at the hospice allowing him to facilitate meetings between former operatives. "Poetry gave us a language for peace," he explained. "When regular diplomacy failed, verses succeeded." The production team's footage now included interviews with diplomats, intelligence officers, and peace activists from around the world, each sharing how Project Verse had created unofficial channels for dialogue and understanding. Sullivan insisted on recording one final session with Colonel Min. The two old soldiers, once enemies, now partners in peace, shared poems they had written during the war. The verses, once laden with hidden military intelligence, now carried a different kind of truth. Sullivan read, "In the darkness of Saigon nights, we wrote our fears in code, never knowing our enemies were writing the same lines in mirror image verse." Min responded, "On opposite sides of the battle we shared the same moon, our poems like secret bridges, crossing no man's land with whispered hopes for peace." The room fell silent after their exchange. Everyone present understood they were witnessing not just a historical revelation, but a model for future conflict resolution. As evening approached, Sullivan asked Morgan to help him craft one final poem, one that would serve as both a confession and a vision for the future. Despite his weakness, his voice grew stronger as he dictated, "Let history record this truth, that in our darkest hours we found light in verses, that when weapons failed, words built bridges, that every poem written in service of war became a seed of peace. Let those who follow know that in the space between enemy and friend lives a poem waiting to transform hate to hope, fear to understanding, war to lasting peace." The military archivists, watching Sullivan dictate these lines, understood that they were witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. Project Verse was emerging from the shadows, not as a classified intelligence operation, but as a testament to the power of artistic expression to transform conflict. Morgan's team worked through the night, weaving together the multiple layers of their story: the personal journey of a dying teacher, the classified history of a unique military program, and the universal truth about art's power to heal divisions and build peace. As dawn approached, Sullivan called Morgan to his bedside. "The story isn't finished," he whispered. "It's just beginning. Promise me you'll help them understand poetry isn't just an art form. It's a tool for peace, a weapon against hatred, a bridge between enemies." Morgan nodded, understanding the weight of this responsibility. Their documentary had become more than a memorial to one man's life. It was now a blueprint for future peace-building efforts. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as international media caught wind of the story. Despite efforts to maintain privacy, news had leaked about a major historical revelation involving Vietnam-era intelligence operations. Reporters gathered outside the hospice, but Dr. Chen's staff maintained a protective barrier around room 217. "We do this on our terms," Morgan insisted, working with military officials to craft a statement that would satisfy public curiosity while protecting sensitive information. Sullivan spent the morning reviewing decades of correspondence with other Project Verse operatives. Each letter, each poem, revealed new layers of the program's impact. A former CIA agent, now running art therapy programs for veterans, wrote, "What began as intelligence gathering became a gathering of souls, each coded verse a step toward understanding." South Korean diplomats shared how poetry circles had facilitated unofficial negotiations during periods of tension with North Korea. Between missile tests and threats, we passed poems like peace offerings, finding humanity in shared metaphors. When politics failed, the hospice itself revealed its deeper purpose. Dr. Chen explained how the facility had been designed with specific rooms for secure meetings, how certain staff members were trained in diplomatic protocols, how even the garden layout facilitated private conversations between former adversaries. "Every rose bush, every bench," she said, was placed to create spaces where enemies could become poets together. The military archivists worked methodically, helping to separate classified operational details from the human story that needed to be told, but Sullivan kept pushing for greater transparency. "The world needs to understand," he insisted during a difficult breathing spell, "that peace isn't built in conference rooms. It's built in moments of shared humanity, in the exchange of verses that speak to common hopes and fears." As the day progressed, more international figures joined their virtual conversations. A former Mossad agent shared how poetry workshops had created unofficial channels between Israeli and Palestinian intelligence services. A Colombian peace negotiator revealed how verse writing had helped FARC rebels and government forces find common ground. Sarah discovered journals from her father's early teaching days, now revealing a double narrative. What had seemed like simple English teacher's notes were actually careful observations of how poetry could be used to heal trauma and build bridges between communities. "You were never just teaching literature," she realized, holding her father's hand. "You were teaching peace." Sullivan nodded weakly. "Poetry was our Trojan horse," he whispered. "We smuggled peace into war zones, one verse at a time." The production, teamwork to capture these revelations while maintaining the delicate balance between disclosure and security. Rachel's cameras documented the increasing convergence of military personnel, diplomatic staff, and poetry advocates in room 217. Colonel Richards brought in more veterans who had been part of Project Verse, each adding new dimensions to the story. One former Special Forces operator, now teaching creative writing in inner-city schools, explained how the program had evolved. "We learned in Vietnam that poetry could carry intelligence," he said. "But we discovered something more valuable. It could carry understanding. Now we're using those same techniques to help gang members find alternatives to violence, to help refugees process trauma, to help communities bridge racial divides." Sullivan's fever returned in the late afternoon, but his delirium proved revealing. He began reciting what seemed like random verses, until Colonel Min, still connected via video call, began translating. "He's using the old codes," Min explained. "But listen to the deeper meaning. He's giving us a roadmap for the future of the program." Through his fever, Sullivan was outlining how Project Verse could transition from a classified military operation to a public peace-building initiative. His verses, even in delirium, contained specific instructions for implementing poetry programs in current conflict zones. Morgan's team captured everything, understanding that they were documenting not just history, but a template for future peace work. The military archivists, initially concerned about security breaches, began to see the value in revealing this aspect of intelligence history. "Sometimes," one senior official noted, Showing our humanity serves national security better than maintaining secrets. As evening approached, Sullivan rallied enough to request a specific gathering. He wanted representatives from every phase of Project Verse, from Vietnam to current operations, to share poems simultaneously. The logistics were complex, but Morgan's team managed to coordinate video calls across multiple time zones. The resulting session was extraordinary. 24 poets from different conflicts, speaking 12 languages, each sharing verses that had once carried military intelligence, but now carried hopes for peace. A former Balkan sniper read, "From my hidden perch, I once watched for enemies. Now I search for words to heal the wounds we gave." A retired KGB agent shared. "In Moscow's winter, we coded secrets in verse, never guessing poems would thaw the Cold War's heart." A young Syrian activist contributed, "Between bombed buildings, children still write their dreams in chalk and courage. Poetry survives." The session lasted 3 hours, with Sullivan insisting on staying awake despite his deteriorating condition. Each poem was recorded, translated, and added to what was becoming an unprecedented document of how art could transform conflict. "This," Sullivan whispered to Morgan during a brief break, "this is what we must preserve. Not the codes, not the intelligence operations, but this proof that enemies can become artists together." The military historians present began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The moment when a classified intelligence program consciously transformed itself into a public peace initiative. Dr. Chen, monitoring Sullivan's vital signs throughout the session, observed something remarkable. His numbers strengthen every time someone shares a poem. It's as if each verse is giving him more time, more purpose. As midnight approached, Sullivan asked Morgan to help him record one final statement, a formal recommendation to declassify specific aspects of Project Verse that could serve the cause of peace. The 8th day dawned with an unexpected urgency. Sullivan's condition had deteriorated significantly overnight, but rather than diminishing his spirit, it seemed to fuel a fierce determination to complete what he had begun. "Morgan," he called out weakly as the first light filtered through the hospice windows, "it's time for the final act." The production team, who had been working in shifts, gathered quickly. They could sense that something momentous was approaching. Dr. Chen checked Sullivan's vitals with concern, but didn't attempt to stop what was unfolding. "Today," Sullivan announced to the room, "we bring it all together. Every thread, every story, every hidden verse. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as a moment when history, art, and humanity converged in an extraordinary way." Sullivan had arranged through his vast network of Project Verse participants for a synchronized global poetry reading that would serve as both a revelation and a transformation. The technical requirements were daunting. Morgan's team set up multiple screens around Sullivan's bed, each connecting to different locations around the world. Military communications specialists arrived to ensure secure connections. Dr. Chen ordered additional medical equipment, knowing Sullivan would need all his strength. "What we're about to do," Sullivan explained to Morgan, "is activate every poetry circle, every writing group, every artistic initiative that grew from Project Verse, not as separate entities, but as one unified voice for peace." The coordination was precise. At exactly 1200 hours Eastern Time, poetry groups across the globe began their readings. The military historians present quickly realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, the moment when a classified intelligence program publicly transformed into a worldwide peace initiative. From a classroom in Hanoi, Colonel Min began, "Once we wrote to guide bombs, now we write to prevent them." The same words transformed by time and understanding. In a Belfast community center, former IRA and British intelligence operatives read together, across barricades, "Of hate. We passed secret verses, never knowing we were building bridges stronger than our walls," from a rehabilitation center in Sarajevo. "In the ruins of war, we found scattered poems like seeds waiting for peace to let them grow." Sullivan, though, barely able to sit up, insisted on participating, his voice weak but clear. carried decades of experience. Let history record how we turned weapons to words, intelligence to understanding, war rooms to writing circles. The readings continued, each location adding its voice to a growing chorus of transformation. But it wasn't just poetry being shared. Each group was also revealing how their local programs had evolved from military intelligence to peace-building initiatives. A former Mossad agent, speaking from Jerusalem, explained how poetry workshops had created unofficial channels between Israeli and Palestinian intelligence services. In Colombia, ex-FARC rebels and government forces described how verse writing had helped them find common ground. Morgan's team captured everything, understanding that they were documenting not just an event, but a fundamental shift in how humanity might approach conflict resolution. Rachel's cameras moved between the screens, recording these intersecting narratives of transformation. The military archivists present began taking notes with increasing urgency. They recognized that this wasn't just about declassifying an old program. It was about understanding how artistic expression could serve both intelligence gathering and peace building simultaneously. Sullivan, despite his weakening condition, remained focused on orchestrating this global revelation. Between the readings, he shared crucial details about how Project Verse had evolved. We learned in Vietnam that poetry could carry military intelligence, he explained. But we discovered something far more valuable. It could carry human intelligence, emotional intelligence, the kind of understanding that prevents wars from starting. As the afternoon progressed, more participants joined the global session. A group of Afghan women poets revealed how they had used traditional verse forms to communicate across battle lines. Korean writers shared how their work had created unofficial channels between North and South. But the most powerful moment came when Sullivan called for what he termed the Bridge of Verses. He had arranged for former enemies from various conflicts to read poems they had written about each other, not during war, but after finding common ground through shared artistic expression. A Vietnamese veteran read about his American counterpart. The enemy's face became human when I heard his verses about home speaking my own heart's language. An Israeli intelligence officer shared work about her Palestinian colleague. Between our people's pain, we found shared metaphors, building peace, one stanza at a time. The impact was profound. The production team struggled to maintain professional distance as they recorded these testimonies of transformation. Even the military officials present were visibly moved. Dr. Chen, monitoring Sullivan's vital signs throughout, noticed something remarkable. "His readings are stabilizing," she whispered to Morgan. "It's as if each shared poem is giving him strength." As evening approached, Sullivan called for the final phase of his planned revelation. He had prepared a series of recommendations for how Project Verse could be officially transformed from a classified program into a public peace-building initiative. "The time for secrets is past," he declared, his voice growing stronger with purpose. "We need to show the world that poetry isn't just an art form. It's a tool for peace, a weapon against hatred, a bridge between enemies." The military historians present began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, the moment when an intelligence program consciously evolved into something more powerful than any classified operation. Sullivan then revealed his final surprise. He had compiled a comprehensive database of every poetry program worldwide that had grown from Project Verse, mapping how artistic initiatives had created channels for dialogue in conflict zones across the globe. "This is our real legacy," he told Morgan. "Not the intelligence we gathered, but the understanding we built. Not the secrets we kept, but the connections we created." The global poetry reading continued into the night, with groups across different time zones adding their voices to what had become a worldwide chorus of transformation. Each testimony, each shared verse, added to the growing evidence that artistic expression could succeed where traditional diplomacy had failed. Morgan's team worked tirelessly to capture every aspect of this extraordinary convergence. They understood that they were documenting not just the end of a classified program, but the birth of a new approach to international peace building. As midnight approached, Sullivan asked for one final reading. Despite his exhaustion, he insisted on sharing a poem he had written specifically for this moment. "Let history remember how we learned," that verses could carry more than secrets, that enemies could become poets, that art could succeed where arms had failed, that in the space between war and peace lives a poem waiting to be shared. Let those who follow understand that every conflict holds within it seeds of reconciliation, waiting to be given voice, that poetry isn't just an art, but a path to lasting peace. The room fell silent as his words faded. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed not just a historical revelation, but a blueprint for future peace-building efforts. The impact of Sullivan's final poem rippled through the global audience. One by one, participants began sharing how Project Verse had transformed their understanding of conflict and resolution. A former CIA operative in Berlin described how poetry circles had maintained communication channels when official diplomacy failed during the Cold War. A South African reconciliation counselor explained how verse-writing workshops had helped heal wounds from the apartheid era. Sullivan, though exhausted, insisted on acknowledging each testimony. "This is the real intelligence," he whispered to Morgan. "Not what we gathered, but what we grew." The military historians present were frantically documenting everything, recognizing that this wasn't just the end of a classified program. It was the emergence of a new paradigm for peace building. Dr. Chen, still monitoring Sullivan's vitals, noticed something extraordinary. "His readings are stabilizing," she told Morgan quietly. "It's as if each shared story is giving him strength." The global session continued with a series of paired readings, former enemies who had become collaborators through their shared commitment to poetry. Each pair demonstrated how artistic expression had succeeded where traditional negotiations had failed. A former Serbian commander and his Bosnian counterpart read together, "We met as enemies across battle lines. Now we write verses about grandchildren, learning that poetry speaks louder than the echoes of old wars." An Israeli security officer and a Palestinian activist shared their joint work. "Between checkpoints and walls, we built bridges of words, finding in shared metaphors the peace hour." Leaders couldn't reach Sullivan watched these exchanges with evident satisfaction. "This," he told Morgan, "is what we must preserve. Not just the history of Project Verse, but its evolution, how an intelligence operation transformed into a movement for peace." As evening deepened, Sullivan revealed another layer of his vision. He had prepared detailed guidelines for how poetry programs could be implemented in current conflict zones, drawing on decades of experience from Project Verse. "The methodology is proven," he explained to the military officials present. "We know it works because we've seen it succeed in the most unlikely places." To demonstrate this, he called on current participants in active conflict regions. A group in Yemen shared how poetry workshops had created neutral spaces for tribal leaders to meet. Syrian refugees described how verse writing helped maintain cultural connections across displaced communities. The production team captured everything, understanding that they were documenting not just the end of one era, but the beginning of another. Rachel's cameras moved between screens, recording these intersecting narratives of transformation and hope. As midnight approached in different time zones, each group added their final testimonies. The cumulative effect was powerful, a worldwide demonstration of how artistic expression could transform conflict into collaboration. Sullivan, despite his failing strength, remained focused on ensuring his legacy would continue. He shared specific instructions for how Project Verse's methodologies could be adapted for future peace-building initiatives. "The key," he explained, "is understanding that poetry isn't just about expressing feelings. It's about creating spaces where enemies can recognize each other's humanity." The dawn of the 9th day brought with it a profound sense of completion. Sullivan, having shared his final revelations about Project Verse, seemed to relax into a peaceful acceptance. The global poetry session had ended, but its impact continued to reverberate through diplomatic channels and peace-building initiatives worldwide. Morgan sat beside Sullivan's bed, reviewing the extraordinary footage they had captured. "What happens now?" he asked softly. Sullivan smiled weakly. "Now? Now the real work begins. The seeds we've planted need tending. The military officials who had been present throughout the revelation had already begun implementing Sullivan's recommendations. Project Verse was being officially transformed from a classified intelligence operation into a public peace-building initiative. The transition would be gradual but irreversible. Sarah, who had barely left her father's side during the past 9 days, found herself receiving calls from educational institutions worldwide. Everyone wanted to know how to implement Sullivan's methods in their own conflict resolution programs. "Your father," Morgan told her, "has given the world something more valuable than intelligence. He's given us a new way to build peace." Dr. Chen, making her morning rounds, noticed a change in Sullivan's demeanor. The urgent energy that had driven him through the revelations had been replaced by a serene calm. "He's ready now," she whispered to Morgan. "He's completed his mission." Throughout the day, messages poured in from around the world. Former Project Verse participants shared how the program had transformed their lives. A Vietnamese poet wrote, "When we were enemies, your verses showed me truth, that humanity survives in spaces between words." A former East German intelligence officer shared, "Through concrete walls and iron curtains, poetry found ways to build tomorrow's peace." Sullivan insisted on recording responses to each message, though his voice was barely a whisper. "Every connection matters," he explained. "Every shared verse builds another bridge." The production team worked to capture these final exchanges, understanding that they were documenting not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a movement. Rachel's cameras focused on the intimate moments between messages, the way Sullivan's eyes lit up at each new connection, the gentle squeeze he gave Sarah's hand when a particularly moving verse was shared. Colonel Richards arrived with news that veteran groups across the country were already implementing Sullivan's poetry programs in their PTSD therapy sessions. "Your methods work," he told his old friend. "They're helping soldiers find their way home." Sullivan nodded, satisfied. "Poetry was always about coming home," he whispered, "about finding our way back to our shared humanity." As afternoon approached, Sullivan asked Morgan to help him record one final message, a letter to future generations who would carry forward the work of transforming conflict through artistic expression. To those who follow, remember that every war carries within it seeds of peace waiting to be nurtured, that every enemy is a friend who hasn't yet heard the right poem, that words have power not just to describe, but to transform our understanding. I leave you not just a method, but a mission, to find in art what weapons cannot achieve, to build through poetry what politics fails to create, to heal through shared verses what hatred tries to destroy. Look for truth in unexpected places. Listen for poetry in enemy voices. Create spaces where words can work. Their quiet magic of transformation. The intelligence we gathered through verses was valuable, but what we discovered was priceless. That art can succeed where force fails. That poetry can bridge what politics cannot span. Keep writing, keep sharing. Keep believing in the power of words to change hearts, in the ability of verses to transform enemies into collaborators in the great work of building lasting peace. The codes we once hidden in poems are no longer secret, but the real mystery remains. How art opens hearts, how shared creativity builds trust, how poetry becomes a bridge between our deepest differences. Continue this work, not as a program, but as a movement. Not as an operation, but as a revolution in how we approach the ancient challenges of conflict and peace. Remember, every poem is a potential bridge, every verse a possible path to understanding, every shared creative moment a step toward lasting peace. The letter, recorded in segments as Sullivan's strength allowed, became the cornerstone of what would become known as the Sullivan Protocol, a methodology for using artistic expression in conflict resolution. Throughout the afternoon, more evidence of the project's impact arrived. A group of Israeli and Palestinian teenagers shared poems they had written together in a workshop based on Sullivan's methods. Former gang members in Chicago described how poetry circles had helped them find alternatives to violence. Dr. Chen reported that hospitals across the country were implementing poetry therapy programs based on Project Verse's techniques. "Your work," she told Sullivan, "is already saving lives in ways you never imagined." Sarah discovered more of her father's legacy as she organized his papers. Hidden among his teaching materials were decades of correspondence with former students who had gone on to implement his methods in their own work. A prison counselor wrote about using poetry to help inmates process trauma and find redemption. A refugee camp coordinator described how verse-writing workshops helped displaced people maintain their cultural identity. A domestic violence counselor shared how poetry groups helped survivors reclaim their voices. As evening approached, Sullivan asked to hear some of the footage from their 9 days of recording. Morgan played selected clips, showing how their simple story about a teacher's poetry had evolved into something far more profound. "We did it," Sullivan whispered, watching the screens. "We showed them that peace has a poetry all its own." The military historians present had completed their initial assessment of Project Verse's transformation. Their report would recommend full declassification of the program's peace-building methodologies, while maintaining necessary security around its intelligence-gathering history. "Your work," one senior official told Sullivan, "will revolutionize how we approach conflict resolution. This is a legacy that will save lives." As night fell, Sullivan's room filled with a gentle peace. The urgent energy of revelation had been replaced by the quiet satisfaction of completion. Sarah read some of her father's earliest poems from Vietnam, now understanding their double meaning as both intelligence communications and profound human truths. Morgan's team prepared for their final interviews, knowing they had captured something extraordinary. The moment when art and intelligence, creativity and conflict resolution, personal story and global impact had converged to create something new. Dr. Chen, checking Sullivan's vitals one last time that evening, smiled gently. "You've done what you needed to do," she told him. "You've ensured your work will continue." Sullivan nodded, his eyes peaceful. "Poetry," he whispered, "will find its way. It always does." The production team began the delicate process of editing their material, understanding that they were crafting not just a documentary but a template for future peace-building efforts. Rachel's careful footage had captured both the global impact of Project Verse and the intimate human moments that gave it power. As midnight approached, Sullivan asked Morgan to read one final poem, not one of his own, but Auden's September 1, 1939, a work that had inspired him throughout his career. "All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame." The words echoed in the quiet room, carrying with them decades of hope, struggle, and transformation. Sullivan smiled, knowing that his affirming flame would continue to light the way for others. Sarah held her father's hand as he drifted into sleep, his mission complete, his legacy secured. The poetry of peace he had nurtured would continue to grow, transforming conflicts in ways that weapons never could. Morgan's team quietly packed their equipment, understanding that they had documented not just the end of one remarkable life, but the beginning of a new approach to building peace through the power of shared artistic expression. Outside room 217, the world continued to respond to Sullivan's revelations. Poetry groups were forming in conflict zones, peace initiatives were adopting his methods, and former enemies were finding common ground through shared creativity. The revolution Sullivan had sparked would continue, carried forward by those who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon for peace is a poem waiting to be shared. In the days that followed, Sullivan's impact continued to multiply. Universities worldwide began establishing peace poetry programs based on his methodology. The Sullivan Protocol was being translated into multiple languages, adapted for different cultural contexts. A group of international peace organizations announced the creation of the Sullivan Poetry Peace Prize, recognizing innovative uses of artistic expression in conflict resolution. The first recipients would include pairs of former enemies who had become collaborators through shared creative work. The military's official assessment of Project Versus transformation yielded unexpected results. Intelligence agencies worldwide began incorporating creative expression into their training programs, recognizing that understanding through art could sometimes achieve what surveillance could not. Sarah found herself becoming the keeper of her father's legacy, fielding requests from organizations eager to implement his methods. Dear Ms. Sullivan, your father's work has revolutionized our approach to community reconciliation. Our poetry workshops in Belfast have brought together people who wouldn't otherwise speak to each other. Respected Sarah Sullivan, the impact of your father's methods in our refugee camps has been extraordinary. Children who couldn't express their trauma are finding their voices through verse. Morgan's production team continued refining their documentary, now understanding that they were creating more than a film. They were crafting a manual for future peace-building efforts. The footage they had captured showed not just what Project Verse had been, but what it could become. Dr. Chen reported that medical schools were incorporating poetry therapy into their curricula, recognizing its value in both patient care and physician well-being. Your father, she told Sarah, has helped us understand that healing requires more than medicine. Colonel Richards brought news from veteran organizations nationwide. Poetry groups were forming in VA hospitals, helping soldiers process trauma and rebuild connections with their communities. One veteran wrote, "In Sullivan's methods, we found what therapy alone couldn't provide, a way to speak the unspeakable, to share the unshared, to find peace in the midst of our internal wars." The international impact continued to grow. Former conflict zones reported success with poetry-based reconciliation programs. In Rwanda, genocide survivors and perpetrators' families were writing verses together. In Colombia, former FARC rebels and their one-time military opponents shared stories through poetry. In the Middle East, Israeli and Palestinian youth were creating joint anthologies. Sullivan watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, his physical strength fading even as his vision gained momentum. Poetry, he told Morgan during one of his more lucid moments, was always meant to be a bridge, not a barrier. The military historians completed their final assessment, recommending that Project Versus methodologies be incorporated into standard peace-building protocols. Their report noted, Sullivan's transformation of an intelligence operation into a peace-building initiative represents a paradigm shift in how we approach conflict resolution. His methods demonstrate that artistic expression can succeed where traditional diplomacy fails. As Sullivan's strength continued to fade, the energy he had invested in revealing Project Verse seemed to transfer to those carrying his work forward. Peace organizations worldwide began implementing his methods, adapting them to local contexts while maintaining their essential principle: that shared creativity could build bridges across the deepest divides. Sarah discovered more of her father's legacy in unexpected places. A prison chaplain wrote about using Sullivan's methods to help death row inmates find peace. A trauma counselor in Syria described how poetry workshops helped children process the horrors of war. The impact rippled through academic circles as well. Universities began establishing peace poetry programs, incorporating Sullivan's methods into conflict resolution curricula. The Harvard Negotiation Project announced a new initiative studying the role of creative expression in international diplomacy. Morgan's team received footage from around the world showing Sullivan's methods in action. A group of teenagers in Belfast, writing together about their hopes for their city's future. Former child soldiers in Uganda, using poetry to reclaim their voices. Indigenous communities in Australia, sharing traditional verses with mining companies to protect sacred lands. Dr. Chen reported that hospices nationwide were implementing poetry programs, recognizing that artistic expression could ease the transition between life and death. Your father's work, she told Sarah, continues to heal in ways we never expected. The Sullivan Protocol began appearing in diplomatic training programs, military peacekeeping missions, and international development initiatives. Its core principle, that artistic expression could transform conflict into collaboration, was proving effective in diverse contexts. As Sullivan's physical presence faded, his spiritual and intellectual legacy grew stronger. Peace organizations worldwide reported success with his methods. In Cyprus, Greek and Turkish communities were sharing traditional verses across the Green Line. In Kashmir, poetry workshops were bringing together people from different sides of the conflict. In South Sudan, tribal leaders were using traditional praise poems to negotiate peace agreements. The production team worked to capture this expanding impact, understanding that their documentary needed to show not just what had been accomplished, but what was still possible. Rachel's careful editing wove together the personal and the global, showing how one man's vision could transform international approaches to peace building. Sullivan's room became a kind of command center for this growing movement. Even as his physical strength diminished, his mind remained sharp, offering guidance to those implementing his methods. Remember, he told a group of peace workers via video call, poetry isn't just about writing verses. It's about creating spaces where truth can be shared, where enemies can become collaborators in understanding. The military's transformation of Project Verse continued to yield surprising results. Intelligence agencies began reporting that poetry-based peace initiatives were providing better insights into conflict resolution than traditional surveillance methods. A senior CIA analyst noted, "What Sullivan showed us is that sometimes the best intelligence comes from creating spaces where people can share their truths freely." Sarah found herself becoming not just the keeper of her father's legacy, but its interpreter for new contexts. She worked with international organizations to adapt his methods for different cultural settings. In Afghanistan, they incorporated traditional Pashtun poetry forms. In South America, they integrated indigenous storytelling traditions. In Africa, they worked with local praise singers, and Griot's Morgan's team captured these adaptations, showing how Sullivan's basic principles could flex to accommodate different cultural expressions while maintaining their core peace-building power. Dr. Chen began documenting the medical impacts of Sullivan's methods. Patients in poetry therapy programs showed improved recovery rates, better mental health outcomes, and stronger community connections. She prepared a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine. The Sullivan Protocol: Artistic Expression as a Tool for Healing Individual and Collective Trauma. As evening approached on what would be Sullivan's final day, his room filled with a peaceful energy. The urgent work of revelation had been completed. Now was the time for transition, for passing the torch to those who would carry it forward. "The poetry will continue," he whispered to Morgan. "It always finds a way to flow where it's needed, most." The production team prepared for their final shots, understanding that they were capturing not an ending, but a beginning. Sullivan's work would continue through thousands of voices worldwide, each adding their own verses to the ongoing poem of peace. As the sun set, Sullivan asked Sarah to read from his first Vietnam journal, the one that had started everything. The verses, once coded intelligence, now carried a different kind of truth. "In war's darkest hours we found light in verses, now in peace's brightest days we find truth in shared words." Sullivan smiled, knowing his work would continue. The revolution he had started, transforming an intelligence operation into a worldwide peace initiative, would grow beyond anything he had imagined. His legacy was secure, not in classified files or military records, but in the countless lives touched by the power of poetry to build bridges across the deepest divides. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.